In 1996, the Wallace family vanished without a trace during their dream vacation. 6 years later, what we found floating in the Rio Grande would change everything we thought we knew about their disappearance. This is the story that made me question everything I believed about missing persons cases. I'm a private investigator, and in my 20 years of experience, I've never encountered anything quite like what happened to the Wallace family. What started as a routine vacation turned into one of the most disturbing mysteries I've ever investigated. Before we dive deep into this case, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the evidence I'm about to share with you will leave you questioning everything. My name is Detective Marcus Chen, and I've spent the better part of my career investigating cases that others have given up on. Cold cases, missing persons, the kind of mysteries that keep you awake at night, staring at crime scene photos and wondering what really happened. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I discovered about the Wallace family. It was the summer of 1996 when I first heard their names. David Wallace, 43, a successful architect from Phoenix. His wife Sarah, 38, a high school English teacher with dreams of writing novels. Their twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, both 14 and about to start their freshman year of high school. They were, by all accounts, the perfect American family, the kind you'd see in a Norman Rockwell painting, complete with a golden retriever named Chester and a 2-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The Wallaces had planned what Sarah called their adventure vacation for months. Unlike their usual trips to Disneyland or beach resorts, this time they wanted something different, something that would give the girls stories to tell when they returned to school. David had discovered a remote cabin rental in the mountains of New Mexico near the Colorado border. The listing promised complete privacy, stunning views, and the kind of digital detox that suburban families dream about. No cell phone towers for miles, no internet, just the 4 of them, nature, and whatever adventures they could create. I remember looking at the family photos the first time. David with his salt and pepper beard and kind eyes, always with his arm around Sarah. Sarah with her infectious smile, and the way she looked at her daughters like they were the most precious things in the world. Emma and Sophie, identical twins who somehow managed to look completely different. Emma, with her serious expression and love for books. Sophie, with her mischievous grin and soccer ball always in hand. Chester, their golden retriever, somehow managed to photobomb every single family picture, his tail always wagging, his expression eternally happy. The last confirmed sighting of the Wallace family was at a gas station in Santa Fe on July 15, 1996. The clerk remembered them because the twins were arguing about which snacks to buy for the trip, and David had joked about how choosing between Doritos and Cheetos was apparently a life-or-death decision when you're 14. Sarah had bought a disposable camera, telling the clerk she wanted to document every moment of their adventure. They paid for gas, filled up their 1994 Ford Explorer, and drove into the mountains. Into what would become one of the most baffling disappearances in American history. The cabin they had rented belonged to an elderly man named Harold Winters, who owned several properties scattered throughout the remote mountain regions. Harold later told investigators that the Wallaces seemed like good people when they'd spoken on the phone. David had asked detailed questions about the property, whether there were any dangerous animals in the area, how to work the well water system, what to do in case of emergencies. Harold had been impressed by David's thoroughness. Most city folk, he said, just wanted to know about the hot water and whether they could get pizza delivered. When the family failed to check out on July 22nd as scheduled, Harold drove up to the cabin to investigate. What he found defied explanation. The Ford Explorer was parked exactly where guests were supposed to park, near the front of the cabin. The doors were unlocked. Sarah's purse was on the passenger seat, containing her wallet, credit cards, and over $300 in cash. David's prescription glasses, which he couldn't see without, were folded neatly on the kitchen counter next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. But it was the state of the cabin that truly unnerved Harold. Breakfast dishes sat in the sink, still containing remnants of what appeared to be pancakes and eggs, 4 plates, 4 sets of utensils, 4 glasses that had contained orange juice. The coffee pot was still warm. Upstairs, all 4 beds appeared to have been slept in. The twins' clothes were laid out on their beds as if they had been planning to get dressed. David and Sarah's suitcases were unpacked, their clothes hanging neatly in the closet. Harold called the sheriff's department immediately. Within hours, the cabin was crawling with investigators, search and rescue teams, and volunteers from the local community. They found Chester's leash hanging by the front door, but no sign of the dog. A search of the immediate area revealed something that would puzzle investigators for years. The family's hiking boots were lined up perfectly on the front porch, as if they had just stepped out of them before going inside. But there were no other shoes missing from their luggage. The initial investigation was thorough and professional. Sheriff Rebecca Martinez had 20 years of experience and had handled her share of missing persons cases in the rugged mountain terrain. Usually, she told me years later, these cases fell into predictable categories: hikers who got lost and succumbed to exposure, domestic situations gone wrong, people running from debts or legal troubles. But the Wallace case fit none of these patterns. David Wallace had no enemies, no debts, no secret life that anyone could uncover. His architectural firm was successful and stable. Sarah was beloved by her students and colleagues. The twins were honor roll students with no behavioral problems, no signs of family discord. Their friends and extended family insisted that the Wallaces were happy, stable, and deeply committed to each other. There was no evidence of marital problems, financial stress, or any other factor that might lead to a family disappearing voluntarily. The search operation was massive. Over 200 volunteers combed the mountainous terrain for any sign of the family. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras swept the area for days. Search dogs were brought in from 3 different states. The FBI opened an investigation within a week, treating it as a potential kidnapping case. But despite all these efforts, not a single trace of the Wallace family was found. As weeks turned into months, theories began to emerge. Some believed the family had been the victims of a random crime, perhaps encountered criminals involved in drug trafficking, which was unfortunately common in some remote areas of New Mexico. Others suggested they might have gotten lost while hiking and fallen victim to the harsh mountain environment. A few conspiracy theorists whispered about alien abductions, pointing to the family's sudden disappearance without a trace. But I had a different theory, one that would eventually lead me to the truth. I believed that whoever had taken the Wallace family was someone they trusted, someone who could approach them without causing alarm, someone who knew their plans and had been watching them. The evidence suggested that the family had left the cabin willingly, perhaps to meet someone or go somewhere they believed was safe. They had taken no provisions, no extra clothes, no money. This suggested they expected to return quickly. The case began to fade from public attention as 1996 turned into 1997, then 1998. Sheriff Martinez retired, and the case file was passed to her replacement. The FBI investigation was scaled back, though the case technically remained open. Harold Winters eventually sold the cabin, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible had happened on his property. The new owners renovated extensively, perhaps hoping to erase the lingering sense of tragedy that seemed to permeate the place. But I couldn't let go of the Wallace family. Something about their disappearance haunted me. Maybe it was the normalcy of it all. The breakfast dishes, the neatly folded glasses, the planned clothes for the next day. These were people who expected to wake up the next morning and continue their vacation. Something had interrupted that expectation, something sudden and unexpected, but not necessarily alarming enough to cause them to resist or fight. In early 2002, I decided to take some personal time and drive to New Mexico to investigate the case myself. I had accumulated several weeks of vacation time and needed a break from the daily grind of insurance fraud and corporate investigations that paid my bills. The Wallace case had become an obsession, a puzzle I couldn't solve but couldn't abandon. I rented a small apartment in Santa Fe and began conducting my own investigation. I started by retracing the family's last known movements. The gas station where they had stopped was still operating, though the clerk who had served them was long gone. I interviewed Harold Winters, who was now in his 70s, but still sharp and eager to talk about the case. He walked me through the cabin, which had been completely renovated, but still gave me an eerie feeling. I could almost see the Wallace family there, making breakfast, planning their day, having no idea that they were about to vanish forever. My breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing old newspaper archives at the Santa Fe Public Library, I discovered something that previous investigators had missed. 3 days before the Wallace family disappeared, a local newspaper had run a small story about a group of religious extremists who had been operating in the mountain regions. The group, calling themselves the Children of the New Dawn, had been under investigation by federal authorities for tax evasion and possible weapons violations. The article mentioned that the group had recently acquired property in the same general area where the Wallace family had been staying. More importantly, it noted that the group's leader, a man named Thomas Shepard, had a history of targeting families with teenage children. According to former members who had escaped the cult, Shepard believed that 14-year-old twins possessed special spiritual significance. This information had apparently been lost in the shuffle of the original investigation, perhaps because it appeared in a local paper just days before the disappearance and no one had made the connection. But to me, it felt like the first real clue in 6 years. I began researching Thomas Shepard and the Children of the New Dawn with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Thomas Shepard was 54 years old in 1996, a former insurance salesman from California who had reinvented himself as a spiritual guru in the early 1990s. His group had moved from place to place, always staying ahead of law enforcement, always finding new recruits among people seeking meaning and purpose in their lives. Former members described him as charismatic but dangerous, capable of convincing people to abandon their families and give him complete control over their lives. The property owned by the Children of the New Dawn was located approximately 15 miles from the Wallace family's cabin, accessible only by a network of dirt roads that required four-wheel drive vehicles. According to county records, the group had purchased the land in early 1996 using a complex web of shell companies that made it difficult to trace the true ownership. This was clearly an organization that understood how to operate in the shadows. I spent weeks trying to locate former members of the cult, people who might have information about what happened to the Wallace family. Most had scattered to the wind after the group dissolved in late 1997, following a raid by federal authorities that resulted in Shepard's arrest on weapons charges. But I finally tracked down a woman named Rebecca Stone, who had been a member of the group for 8 months in 1996. Rebecca was reluctant to talk at first, but eventually agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in Albuquerque. She was in her 40s now, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that seemed haunted by whatever she had experienced with the Children of the New Dawn. She told me that Shepard had become increasingly unstable in the summer of 1996, convinced that the world was about to end and that only his chosen followers would survive the coming apocalypse. According to Rebecca, Shepard had sent out recruitment teams to identify potential new members, particularly families with teenagers who could be indoctrinated into the group's beliefs. These teams would scout camping areas, cabin rentals, and remote tourist destinations, looking for families that fit Shepard's criteria. The Wallace family, with their identical twin daughters, would have been exactly what Shepard was seeking. Rebecca's information gave me a new direction for my investigation, but I still needed concrete evidence linking the cult to the Wallace family's disappearance. That evidence came in the most unexpected way possible, from a place I never could have anticipated. It came from the Rio Grande, nearly 6 years after the family had vanished, in the form of a discovery that would haunt me for the rest of my life. On March 23, 2002, a group of river rafters discovered something floating in the Rio Grande near the small town of Pilar, New Mexico. At first, they thought it was debris from recent flooding. But as they got closer, they realized it was a waterlogged suitcase, the kind of expensive luggage that well-to-do families take on vacation. Inside that suitcase, preserved by the cold mountain water and sealed plastic bags, were personal items that belonged to the Wallace family. The most significant item was Sarah Wallace's journal, written in her distinctive handwriting and detailing the first 3 days of their vacation. The entries were cheerful and optimistic, describing the beautiful scenery, the girls' excitement about hiking and exploring, David's pleasure at being disconnected from work. But the final entry, dated July 18th, contained a detail that made my blood run cold. Sarah had written, "Met the most interesting man today while the girls were fishing. He said he runs a spiritual retreat in the mountains and invited our whole family to visit. David is skeptical, but the man seemed so genuine, so kind. He knew so much about our family, almost like he'd been watching us. He said Emma and Sophie have old souls, that they're special. I'm not sure what to think, but there's something compelling about him. He's picking us up tomorrow morning for a tour of his retreat. I have a strange feeling about this, but maybe that's just excitement for a new adventure." That journal entry was the last confirmed communication from any member of the Wallace family. But it wasn't the most disturbing item found in the suitcase. Wrapped carefully in plastic was a disposable camera, the same camera Sarah had bought at the gas station in Santa Fe. When I had the film developed, the photos told a story that no amount of investigation could have prepared me for. The first dozen photos were exactly what you'd expect from a family vacation. The girls posing by mountain streams, David grilling hamburgers on the cabin's front porch, Sarah reading a book in a rocking chair, looking peaceful and content. But the final photos were different. They showed the family standing with a tall, bearded man who I immediately recognized as Thomas Shepard. The man was smiling, but there was something predatory in his expression, something that made me understand why Sarah had felt uneasy. The last photo on the roll showed something that still gives me nightmares. It was taken inside what appeared to be a large wooden building, possibly a barn or meeting hall. The Wallace family was standing in the center of the room, surrounded by dozens of people in white robes. David and Sarah looked confused, perhaps beginning to realize that they had made a terrible mistake. But Emma and Sophie looked terrified, pressed close together, their eyes wide with fear. What happened to the Wallace family after that final photograph was taken remains a mystery that I may never solve completely. The Children of the New Dawn compound was raided by federal authorities in November 1997, but by then the group had scattered. Thomas Shepard was arrested on weapons charges, but died in federal custody before he could be questioned about the Wallace family. Most of his followers disappeared, and those who could be located claimed to have no knowledge of the family's fate. But Rebecca Stone provided me with one final piece of information that I believe reveals the truth about what happened to the Wallaces. According to her, Shepard had constructed a series of underground bunkers on the compound property, places where he could hide people who were being prepared for the coming apocalypse. These bunkers were built to be completely undetectable from the surface, accessible only through concealed entrances that looked like natural rock formations or old tree stumps. When federal authorities raided the compound, they found evidence of these bunkers, but were unable to locate the actual entrances. The property was remote and vast, covering hundreds of acres of mountainous terrain. Despite extensive searches with ground-penetrating radar and other advanced equipment, the bunkers were never found. If the Wallace family was taken to one of these underground hiding places, their bodies might still be there, waiting to be discovered. The suitcase found in the Rio Grande was likely placed there intentionally, perhaps by a former cult member who wanted the world to know what had happened to the Wallace family without directly implicating themselves. The timing of its discovery, nearly 6 years after the disappearance, suggests that someone had been holding on to it, waiting for the right moment to let the truth begin to emerge. I continue to investigate this case, even though it has consumed 6 years of my life and brought me closer to human evil than I ever wanted to be. I think about David and Sarah Wallace, who simply wanted to give their daughters a memorable vacation. I think about Emma and Sophie, 14-year-old girls who should have grown up to graduate high school, go to college, fall in love, and have families of their own. I think about Chester, their golden retriever, whose fate remains as mysterious as that of his human family. Sometimes I drive up to the mountains of New Mexico and walk the trails near where the Wallace family spent their last free moments. I listen to the wind through the pine trees and wonder if somewhere deep underground there are answers waiting to be found. I wonder if Thomas Shepard took his secrets to the grave, or if somewhere there's a survivor who knows the truth about what happened during those final days of July 1996. The official case file lists the Wallace family as missing persons, presumed dead, but I know they're more than statistics in an unsolved case file. They were real people with hopes and dreams and love for each other. They deserve better than to vanish without a trace, to become nothing more than a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting strangers in remote places. What truly haunts me about the Wallace case isn't just the mystery of their disappearance, but the randomness of it all. They were a normal family, doing normal things, making the kind of ordinary decisions that families make every day. The choice to take a different kind of vacation. The decision to trust a friendly stranger who seemed interested in their family. These small choices led them into a nightmare that no one could have anticipated. I keep Sarah's journal in my office, along with copies of those final photographs. Sometimes I read her words about the interesting man they met, and I wonder what would have happened if David's skepticism had won out. What if they had declined Shepard's invitation? What if they had packed up and left the mountains a day early? These are the kinds of questions that can drive an investigator insane, but I can't stop asking them. The truth is, we may never know exactly what happened to the Wallace family during those final hours. But I believe their story serves as a reminder that evil often wears a friendly face, that predators know how to identify and isolate their victims, and that even the most ordinary family vacation can turn into an unimaginable nightmare. The mountains of New Mexico still hold their secrets, and somewhere in those vast wilderness areas, the Wallace family's final chapter remains unwritten. As weeks turned into months after finding the suitcase, I became obsessed with locating those underground bunkers that Rebecca Stone had described. I hired a team of ground-penetrating radar specialists and spent my own money on equipment that could detect anomalies beneath the surface. The federal authorities had given up their search, but I couldn't abandon the possibility that the Wallace family might still be down there, waiting to be found. The former children of the New Dawn compound stretched across nearly 400 acres of rugged mountain terrain. Much of it was inaccessible by vehicle, requiring hours of hiking through dense forest and over rocky outcroppings. I spent entire weekends walking every inch of that property, looking for anything that might indicate a concealed entrance. Old tree stumps that seemed too perfectly positioned, rock formations that appeared slightly artificial, patches of ground that looked different from the surrounding area. My persistence finally paid off in August 2002, when I discovered what appeared to be a ventilation shaft hidden among a cluster of boulders near the eastern edge of the property. The shaft was barely visible, concealed by years of accumulated pine needles and mountain debris. But when I cleared away the natural camouflage, I found a metal pipe extending deep into the ground. When I dropped a small stone into the pipe, I could hear it falling for several seconds before it finally hit bottom. The discovery of the ventilation shaft convinced me that I was on the right track, but accessing whatever lay beneath would require professional help. I contacted a team of cave rescue specialists from Colorado, explaining that I was investigating a missing persons case and needed to explore what might be an underground structure. The team leader, a man named Jake Morrison, had 30 years of experience in underground rescue operations and agreed to help with the investigation. Jake's team arrived in September with specialized equipment for underground exploration. Using a fiber optic camera lowered through the ventilation shaft, we were able to confirm that there was indeed a large underground chamber approximately 20 feet below the surface. The camera revealed concrete walls, electrical wiring, and what appeared to be living quarters furnished with bunk beds and basic amenities. But most disturbing were the metal rings bolted to the concrete walls, suggesting that people had been restrained in this underground prison. Getting into the bunker required locating the main entrance, which we eventually found concealed beneath what appeared to be a natural rock slide. The entrance had been expertly disguised to look like a pile of boulders that had fallen from the cliff face above. But close examination revealed that the rocks were actually lightweight concrete replicas, designed to be moved aside to allow access to a steel door hidden beneath. When we finally opened that door and descended into the underground chamber, the smell hit us immediately. It was the unmistakable odor of death, decay, and human suffering that had been trapped in that confined space for years. Jake's team was experienced with body recovery operations, but even they were visibly shaken by what we discovered in Thomas Shepard's underground prison. The bunker was larger than we had initially estimated, consisting of multiple rooms connected by narrow concrete corridors. The main chamber contained 12 bunk beds, a makeshift kitchen area, and a bathroom that consisted of little more than a bucket and a water spigot. But it was the smaller rooms that revealed the true horror of what had happened here. These were isolation cells, each containing a single cot and those metal rings we had seen on the camera. In one of these isolation cells, we found evidence that confirmed my worst fears about the Wallace family's fate. Scratched into the concrete wall were the words, "Emma and Sophie Wallace, July 1996, followed by a series of hash marks that appeared to be counting days. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had carved, "Mom and Dad fought for us until the end." The sight of those desperate messages, written by teenage girls who knew they were going to die, is something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. But the physical evidence was even more damning. In a storage room at the back of the bunker, we discovered personal belongings that clearly belonged to the Wallace family. David's prescription glasses, which we knew had been left on the kitchen counter at the cabin. Sarah's wedding ring, which she never removed. A soccer ball that had to have belonged to Sophie, along with a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that was likely Emma's summer reading assignment. Most heartbreaking were the family photographs that had been torn from Sarah's purse and scattered on the floor of the storage room. Pictures of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family vacations to happier places. Someone had deliberately destroyed these images of the Wallace family's joy and love, as if trying to erase every trace of their happiness from existence. Jake's team also discovered something that explained how the suitcase had ended up in the Rio Grande 6 years later. Hidden behind a false wall was a smaller chamber that contained the personal effects of what appeared to be multiple families. Suitcases, clothing, jewelry, and identification documents from at least 6 different families who had visited the area between 1994 and 1997. Someone had been collecting trophies from Shepard's victims, keeping them as souvenirs of the cult leader's twisted campaign of murder. Among these items was a handwritten list in Thomas Shepard's distinctive handwriting, documenting what he called his spiritual acquisitions. The Wallace family was listed as acquisition number 4, with a note that read, Twins possess exceptional spiritual energy, perfect for the final ceremony. Below their names, Shepherd had written detailed observations about each family member, suggesting that he had been watching them for several days before making contact. The list also contained the names and descriptions of other families, some of whom I was able to match with missing persons reports from the mid-1990s. The Hendersons from Texas, who had disappeared while camping in Colorado in 1995. The Morrison family from California, who had vanished during a hiking trip in Utah in 1994. All were families with teenage children. All had disappeared without a trace in remote wilderness areas. Forensic analysis of the bunker revealed evidence of systematic torture and murder spanning at least 3 years. Blood samples found on the concrete walls matched DNA from several missing persons cases. The isolation cells showed signs of prolonged habitation, suggesting that victims were kept alive for weeks or months before being killed. Scratch marks on the walls indicated desperate attempts to escape, and chemical analysis revealed that some form of sedative had been used to keep prisoners docile. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was a series of videotapes hidden in a waterproof container behind the furnace. These tapes, recorded by Thomas Shepherd himself, documented what he called his spiritual ceremonies, elaborate rituals that involved the systematic torture and murder of entire families. I have watched these tapes only once, and I pray that I will never have to see them again. The tape labeled Ceremony 4 showed the final hours of the Wallace family's lives. David and Sarah were forced to watch as their daughters were tortured, their desperate pleas for mercy ignored by Shepherd and his followers. The twins were kept alive for several days after their parents were killed, subjected to what Shepherd called purification rituals that were nothing more than sadistic torture designed to break their spirits before death. Emma and Sophie Wallace died on July 25, 1996, exactly 1 week after their family had been taken from the cabin. According to Shepherd's detailed notes, their deaths were part of a larger ritual designed to prepare for what he believed would be the end of the world. Their bodies, along with those of their parents, were dissolved in acid in a makeshift crematorium that we discovered in a separate chamber of the underground complex. The investigation of the bunker took nearly 3 months and involved forensic specialists from multiple federal agencies. In the end, we were able to confirm the deaths of 17 people, including the Wallace family, who had been murdered by Thomas Shepherd and his followers between 1994 and 1997. The cult had targeted families specifically because Shepherd believed that destroying family bonds would somehow transfer spiritual energy to his group. Many of Shepherd's followers were eventually tracked down and arrested, though most claimed to have no knowledge of the murders. A few, however, were willing to provide details about the cult's operations in exchange for reduced sentences. According to these witnesses, Shepherd had planned to kill dozens more families before federal authorities raided the compound and forced the group to scatter. The discovery of the underground bunker and the evidence it contained finally brought closure to multiple missing persons cases that had baffled law enforcement for years. But for me, it also brought a deep sense of sadness and rage that I struggle with to this day. The Wallace family had died horribly, far from home, at the hands of a madman who saw them as nothing more than sacrifices for his twisted beliefs. I think often about the final moments of David and Sarah Wallace, forced to watch their children suffer while being powerless to help them. I think about Emma and Sophie, 14-year-old girls who should have been worried about high school and boys and all the normal concerns of teenagers. Instead, they spent their final days in an underground prison, knowing that they were going to die, scratching messages into concrete walls in the desperate hope that someone would eventually find them. The Wallace family's story serves as a reminder that evil exists in the world, often hiding behind facades of spirituality and enlightenment. Thomas Shepherd convinced his followers that they were doing God's work, that the families they murdered were somehow obstacles to spiritual progress. This kind of twisted logic has been used throughout history to justify unspeakable acts of violence, and it continues to this day in various forms. But their story is also a testament to the power of love and family bonds. Even in their final hours, facing unimaginable horror, the Wallace family fought for each other. David and Sarah died trying to protect their daughters. Emma and Sophie found strength in each other, holding on to hope even when hope seemed impossible. Their love for each other transcended even death, leaving behind messages that would eventually lead to the discovery of their fate. The case officially closed in 2003, with Thomas Shepard posthumously charged with 17 counts of first-degree murder. The surviving members of the Children of the New Dawn, who participated in the killings, received life sentences without the possibility of parole. The underground bunker was sealed, and the property was eventually sold to the federal government, which designated it as a memorial site for the victims. Every year on July 18th, the anniversary of the Wallace family's disappearance, I drive up to the mountains of New Mexico and visit the memorial that was erected near the site of their final resting place. I bring flowers and spend a few quiet moments thinking about a family that simply wanted to spend a week together in the mountains, away from the stress and complications of everyday life. Sometimes other people are there too, family members of other victims, law enforcement officers who worked on the case, people who were touched by the story and wanted to pay their respects. We don't usually talk much, but there's a shared understanding among us about the importance of remembering these victims, of ensuring that their deaths meant something more than just another statistic in the files of unsolved crimes. The Wallace case changed my life in ways I'm still discovering. It taught me that evil can wear any face, that predators are often skilled at identifying and manipulating their victims, and that the most ordinary decisions can have extraordinary consequences. But it also taught me about the resilience of the human spirit, the power of love to endure even in the darkest circumstances, and the importance of never giving up on finding the truth. I continue to work as a private investigator, but I'm much more selective about the cases I take on. I focus primarily on missing persons cases, particularly those involving families with children. I've been able to bring closure to several families over the years, and while most of these cases don't involve the kind of horror that characterized the Wallace investigation, each resolution feels like a small victory against the darkness that exists in the world. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had never become obsessed with the Wallace case, if I had simply accepted the official conclusion that they had probably gotten lost in the mountains and died of exposure. Would other families have fallen victim to Thomas Shepard if his crimes had never been discovered? Would the underground bunker still be hidden beneath the New Mexico mountains, waiting for someone else to stumble across its terrible secrets? These are questions without answers, but they remind me of the importance of persistence in seeking justice for victims who can no longer speak for themselves. The Wallace family's voices were silenced in that underground prison, but their story continues to be told through the evidence they left behind and the impact their deaths had on everyone who worked to find the truth. The suitcase found floating in the Rio Grande was the key that unlocked this terrible mystery, but I often wonder who put it there and why they waited 6 years to do so. Was it a former cult member who finally found the courage to come forward? Was it someone who had discovered the bunker independently and wanted to ensure that the victims would eventually be found? We may never know the identity of this person, but their decision to place that suitcase in the river ensured that the Wallace family's story would eventually be told. As I write this, more than 20 years have passed since the Wallace family disappeared, and nearly 20 years since we discovered the truth about their fate. Their story has been the subject of books, documentaries, and countless articles about cult violence and family safety, but for me, they will always be more than just a case study or a cautionary tale. They were real people who loved each other, who trusted the wrong person at the wrong time, and who paid the ultimate price for that trust. David Wallace never got to see his daughters graduate from high school or walk them down the aisle at their weddings. Sarah Wallace never got to finish the novel she was planning to write or see her students succeed in their own lives. Emma and Sophie Wallace never got to experience first love, college, careers, or families of their own. Chester, their beloved golden retriever, never got to grow old chasing tennis balls in their backyard. All of these futures were stolen by a man who believed that other people's lives belonged to him. But in some small way, their story lives on through the work of investigators like myself who refuse to give up on finding missing persons, through the law enforcement officers who take these cases seriously, and through the families who continue to search for their own missing loved ones. The Wallace family's legacy is a reminder that every missing person matters, that every family deserves answers, and that evil can only prevail when good people refuse to act. The mountains of New Mexico, where the Wallace family spent their final days, remain as beautiful and serene as ever. Tourists still visit the area, families still rent cabins for their vacations, and children still play in the mountain streams where Emma and Sophie Wallace once fished with their father. But those of us who know the area's dark history see it differently now, forever marked by the knowledge of what happened in those underground chambers. Sometimes I receive calls from other investigators working on similar cases, asking for advice or information about cult-related crimes. I always try to help, sharing what I learned from the Wallace investigation and hoping that my experience might prevent other families from suffering the same fate. The world is full of predators like Thomas Shepard, people who use spiritual or ideological beliefs to justify acts of unspeakable cruelty. Our only defense against them is vigilance, education, and a commitment to protecting the innocent. The Wallace case will always be the most important work of my career, not because it brought me fame or recognition, but because it brought justice for 4 people who deserved so much better than the fate that befell them. Their story is a tragedy, but it's also a testament to the power of truth to eventually prevail, even when that truth is buried 20 feet underground in a concrete bunker hidden in the mountains of New Mexico.